Common Sense presents Makin Sense 2, The Reawakening. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I'm joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Sage of Saxony, James Myberg. Broadcasting from the last vestiges of the British Empire, the Director of Wealth of Audley Capital, the Wolf of Waterloo, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Hopping across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., we are joined by the Director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the policy wonk of the Potomac, Richard Tren, and finally, joining us from the Common Sense HQ in Johannesburg, the founder of France Cranier Private Clients and the editor of the Common Sense, the menace of Melrose Arch, France Cranier. We have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen, but I think let's hop to the United States, Richard, where you can tell us about what Trump is doing with crime in D.C.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. I'm speaking to you from the District of Columbia, from the swampy Potomac, where apparently we've been occupied by military forces. And it's causing all sorts of consternation and upset. But it's kind of interesting just for what it says about broader politics in the United States. So let's give a bit of background. The District of Columbia is a federal district. The Constitution of the United States allows for a federal district. The framers did not want any one state to have a particular sort of overdue influence over over the federal government or over any other state. So they created a federal district where the federal government would sit, and Virginia and Maryland gave up their worst land, their most swampy, undesirable land. Virginia actually ended up taking it back, but this is where we are. We're on the border of Virginia and Maryland, and it's this swampy. Anyone who's been here in July will know how unpleasant the temperature can get. But this is a federal district. The DC is not a state. It was always governed by the US Congress until 1973, when Congress passed the Home Rule Act, which devolved power. It allowed for the residents of DC to elect a council and elect a mayor. And they have powers, certain powers over policing, but their powers are limited. So they can't, like the mayor can come up with a budget, but the budget has to be approved by Congress. They can't go around changing laws. They need congressional approval for all sorts of things. If they wanted, let's say, change criminal felony law, they would have to get approval from Congress. It has devolved power, but Congress still has a great deal to say, and it remains a federal district, despite years of campaigns, mostly by the Democratic Party, to turn DC into a state. And they want to do that so that they could get 2 extra senators that they know would be reliable Democratic votes. So I've been living in DC since 2006, so it's coming up on 20 years. And when I first moved here, crime was declining. And it kept going down, as it did in most cities around the country for many years. And there are all sorts of reasons for this decline in crime. People on the right will point to broken windows policing policies, which we don't need to go into this, but basically taking care of the small crimes, and the bigger crimes kind of take care of themselves. But there was generally in DC an improvement in policing, better prosecutions of crime, and crime went down, and the city prospered as a result. So, when I first moved here, 14th Street in Northwest was kind of a no-go area. It was dangerous to go there. I remember being invited to a party nearby 14th Street, and we couldn't get there because someone had been stabbed and was lying dead on the pavement. That's not a laughing matter, but it shows you how that was when I first moved here. It was kind of a dangerous area. Now, 14th Street is where all the smart restaurants are, where you could get a 2-bedroom condominium will probably cost you more than $1 million. So the reduction in crime allowed for a real flourishing of DC. So things started improving, but things started to change. So, and a few events marked a change in crime policies around the country and in DC. In 2014, A young man called Michael Brown was killed in the city of Ferguson in Missouri. It turned out to be a lawful police killing. It was by a policeman. And then, of course, fast forward to 2020, famously George Floyd killed by a policeman, not a lawful killing, in Minneapolis. And this really accelerated a pushback against the successful policies that reduced crime. And not just in DC, but around the country, you had these calls for defunding the police and for changing the way criminals are prosecuted. So DC, there was a real reduction in the DC police force. We're still not back up to the numbers of policemen that the mayor really wants, and that we need. There was also other changes so not just a retreat in policing, but a change in prosecution. So, and DC is not alone in this. Other big cities, Los Angeles, New York, did this, where any theft, so any shoplifting of, I think it was under $950, something around there, would not be prosecuted as a crime. It would be kind of a misdemeanor. So that, what this led to was a spate of increase in robberies. It turns out, Gabriel, you might be surprised to know this, that if the police withdraw and if you stop prosecuting crimes, criminals don't suddenly give up crime and go and volunteer at the local orphanage. Turns out that they actually start committing more crimes, because that's
Richard,
what they do.
I don't believe you. I do not believe you.
So who could have predicted? So what you saw in DC after this retreat, and what's now known in the literature is that the Ferguson effect, you might even call it now the George Floyd effect, reducing police numbers, stop prosecuting crimes, you see increases in crime. So in 2023, I think at the height of the homicides, we had a homicide rate of about 40 per 100,000, among the highest in the United States. That's kind of comparable to South African homicide rates. I looked this up. I think South Africa is slightly higher. It has come down a bit in DC. So 2023 was 40, it's down to about 30 now. But aside from
that's crazy.
Yes,
that
it's
number.
high. It's very high.
The global average is about 4 or 5.
Yes, it's high.
South Africa's number sits at around 40 and is wildly high.
Yes. So for DC, this is a high.
Must be completely at odds with. I mean, I think the US rate must be about, I can't remember what I last saw, 6 or 7. I mean, this is off the charts. Yeah,
it's very high. This was 2023 at the height of these and of the crime. It's so it has come down again since then. So 2024, I think I looked up, is about 29 or 28 per 100,000. And a lot of these were restricted in. I'm speaking to you now from my office down in Georgetown. Most of these murders, these homicides, are a lot of them gang related, happening in the poorer parts in Southeast DC, Northeast DC, the more impoverished parts of DC. A lot of them gang related, but nevertheless high crime. What you saw after the retreat, after kind of coincided with the pandemic and retreat in policing, a sharp increase in carjackings, and most of them committed by teenagers, often by teenage girls. I'm talking 13, 14-year-old girls, often armed, sometimes with knives, with pepper spray, and numerous cases, including several that ended in the deaths of. There was a while where they were targeting Uber drivers. During the pandemic, there were a lot of Uber drivers doing Uber Eats and Deliveroo kind of things. They were a particular target, and some of them ended up in horrific deaths. So this became a real problem. But it's not just those kind of crimes. Can I just, if I've got a moment, kind of describe what it's like trying to go shopping in DC? If you go to the CVS, which is kind of like the equivalent of a Boots or a Discount, it's a pharmacy. Almost everything now is locked up behind plexiglass. You want to go in there, you want to buy some razor blades and some toothpaste. You've got to find the aisle, you ring a bell, you wait. Eventually somebody comes by, unlocks the plexiglass, you take out what you want, they immediately lock it up, and you've got to go and pay for it. It's just annoying. It's become very expensive for retailers to do business here. The prices have gone up. It's just like the cost on business is huge. I had to go. I wanted to go buy. I was staying with some friends. I wanted to go and buy them a nice bottle of champagne to take for the weekend. So I went to the Whole Foods, a nice upmarket supermarket here in DC, and the expensive bottles of champagne were in boxes, but the boxes were empty. So if I wanted to buy it, I had to take the box down, find a guy who said he had to go and call the manager. The manager had to come over. He went to the back, got the bottle, wouldn't give it to me, accompanied me to the checkout. Only once I'd paid did he hand me the bottle. Now, understand that the amount of time, it took him, I think, about 10 minutes of the manager's time for me to buy one bottle, on which the markup is what? Tiny. I mean, retail markup is very small. What this means, I'm just talking about the effect of crime on lifestyle. It's just made everything more expensive. Shops are closing, and it's just annoying to have to deal with this. But so then there was a few weeks ago, aside from the murders and the just a general annoyance of this kind of crime and the expense, there was a. Have you heard of Big Balls? He's a teen. He was a teenager Doge employee, one of Elon Musk's guys, who was with a friend, and they were, again, by a group of young teenagers, tried to carjack them. And Big Balls, I forget what his real name is, but he goes by Big Balls. And given his behavior, he is kind of ballsy. He intervened, and they beat him up and beat him severely. And this, because he was a Doge employee, got made the news. And so Trump called in the National Guard. To reiterate, DC is a federal district. It is not a state. What normally happens is at the state level, the governor of each state is in charge of the National Guard, which is a kind of temporary part-time military that intervenes in emergencies. So if there's a flood or an earthquake, the governor can call in the state National Guard or request that the president bring in the National Guard to help in emergency situations. But Trump, so he called in the National Guard to help with policing in DC and just be a presence on the street. And I've actually not seen very much of them today, but funny enough, today I saw several of them walking up and down in Georgetown, and they're just in their fatigues and their camouflage, and they're a presence on the street. What's happened is a sharp decline in crime. I think there hasn't been a single homicide in DC for 2 weeks, maybe a bit longer. A very sharp decline in carjackings, and generally a decline in all crime. But of course, people are very upset. A lot of DC residents, and I will get into this, who is and who isn't upset, have been very perturbed that this is a sort of sign of creeping fascism, of a growing militarization of police. And yesterday was Labor Day in DC, and I left a little gym class that I go to, and at the corner of 14th Street and U Street in Northwest DC, there was a big protest. It actually turned out it was a fun run protest. So there was mostly young people getting together to protest the militarization of police, the so-called the Trump takeover. There's some photos of this little gathering. That's at the corner of 14th and U, and it's in front of a DC municipal building. And, it was kind of interesting. There you can see a sign saying, "End the occupation," as though we are, I don't know, Poland 1939 and the Wehrmacht has marched in. There were other signs. Look at that sign. I'll get back to that flag there. There you see, that's the DC flag. It's 2 stripes and 3 stars. And what they've done is they superimposed the Gadsden flag on top of that. So that is the Gadsden flag is a Revolutionary War era flag of a rattlesnake with the phrase underneath, "Don't tread on me." And it was a Revolutionary era cry for liberty. But for at least the last 50 years, it has become a symbol of the libertarian movement, of people advocating for limited government, for getting the government out of our lives. What you need to understand about DC is that this is a 95, perhaps slightly higher, Democratic voting district. This is overwhelmingly Democratic. And for I don't know how long, successive Democratic presidents and Congresses have trod on states' rights, have exerted government power all over the place, everywhere, whenever they can. And suddenly, for these far left progressive DC's residents are suddenly upset that it's happening to them, that someone else is apparently treading on their rights. And I'm sorry, but it's almost make you want to gag. ICE, we can talk about. ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and there have been quite a few ICE raids. This one I love here. We stand for women, minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, and capital T, the climate. As Francis said, what does it mean to stand against the climate? I'm not quite sure. I think this person is more interested in signaling some virtue than actually doing anything about anything. But anyway, what I didn't show there were quite a few signs, no kings signs, and there've been around the country a lot of no kings protests against a monarchy. We don't want Trump to be acting like a king. And fine, I'm with them there. We're not a monarchy. We're a constitutional republic. I don't want the president to have monarchical powers. But let's be clear, in DC, what he's doing is entirely consistent with the Constitution. It is legal. He's allowed to do this. This is not an invasion. It's not an occupation. But where were these people, excuse me, when President Biden was canceling, I use inverted commas there, student loan? He wasn't canceling them. He was transferring billions of dollars of loans that adults freely took out to buy themselves an education and then decided they didn't want to pay it back. And he transferred those loans to everybody else. Where were these people when Obama was acting like a king and when Congress didn't bend to his will? He said he had a pen and a phone and he would act on his own. We've had successive presidents acting like kings, and suddenly they're objecting to it. They don't care about presidents acting like kings. They care about when it isn't their president, when it was someone that they didn't vote for. And I guarantee you the next time there's a Democrat in the White House who starts abusing power and acting in a way that goes around Congress or violates constitutional norms, they will be nowhere to be seen. Well, I'll tell you where they'll be seen. They'll be cheering it on, just as they were cheering on Biden and they were cheering on Obama. So, forgive me, but I have not much time for these people. And I could look at the demographics of the crowd there. I know these kind of people. I've lived here for nearly 20 years. These are the upper middle class lobbyists, lawyers, political aides, investment bankers who are in their Lululemon outfits that cost $100 for the pants and just find it slightly objectionable. That there should be somebody in the White House who isn't who they don't approve of. What's interesting is the response from the mayor. So initially, the mayor is a woman called Muriel Bowser. She's been elected twice. She's coming up for re-election, I think, in maybe 2 years' time. She initially came out against this, but she's changed her tune pretty quickly. And she's a savvy political operator. She knows her constituency. I'm not sure if she's done polling, but I think that she actually cares more about the mothers in Southeast DC who have had to bury their children because of gang violence and other crime. That she has come out praising this and saying what a difference it has made to policing to have a presence on the streets, an increased law enforcement. So this is kind of interesting to me that you have this dichotomy that again, it's almost like the researcher, the author Rob Henderson talks of luxury beliefs. The people who I saw gathering at 14th and U can afford to isolate themselves from the kind of violent crime that other DC residents can't get away from. And they can afford to berate these National Guard people on the streets, and because they don't have to pay the price. And I'll shut up soon, I'm banging on too long, but the interesting thing is that, again, Trump has the right to do this in DC. He's been threatening to do the same thing in Illinois, in New York, so for Chicago and for New York and for other big cities. He's on shaky ground there. He doesn't have the right. I think that he would be violating the Constitution there. And I think it would be a dangerous move for him to do that constitutionally. the governors there should be asking. But what he has this kind of preternatural ability to find a topic that has popular support and that drives the Democrats insane. So he's effectively had the mayor of Chicago coming up. Chicago is one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Most of the crime is in the south side of Chicago. A lot of it affects Black and minority people living in poverty there. And you've had this mayor coming up basically dismissing people's concerns about crime. Same with the governor of Illinois, Pritzker, a billionaire, who's come out dismissing people's concerns about crimes. And Trump has shown this incredible politically savvy way of finding an issue that people agree on. Everybody's concerned about crime. Most ordinary people are. And he's shown that he's prepared to do something about it. And so I think this is a political winner for Trump. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Sorry, I've been banging on too long, but I'll shut up
thank
there.
you. Thank you, Richard. Simon, does that cover?
Yeah,
Do you have any questions?
No, I mean, Richard brings up this really interesting point that so many progressives caught, or rather contracted. I think it's like a delusion, because you see, especially since 2020, you see it across major cities in the world, and you've seen it on many occasions in London, where it appears that the authorities are siding with the criminals and reducing the rights of victims. But we've seen it now in Cape Town in the past 2 weeks with this bizarre incident where the chair of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Policing, Ian Cameron, who's a DA MP, is attacked near Nyanga, taking two other MPs to a surprise visit to the Philippine Police Training Academy. On their way back to the airport, they get bricks through the window. You know, someone who's going to throw a brick through your window, he's not there with a feather duster. It's not like, hi, tickle you, okay? He wants to hurt you. And one of the MPs gets really hurt. And Ian Cameron, on this occasion, had his firearm with him, and he acted in self-defense. I don't think that could be in dispute. But the response kind of, everyone's going, well, I'm glad that he's okay, and this highlights the dangers of that specific area in Cape Town and this propensity toward violence. But you wait a week and a half later, and you get the media coming out, but then not just the media. You get these obscure parties going, well, actually, we need to have a conversation about self-defense or the limits of. And I think, and Frans, correct me if I'm wrong, if you've been following the story, there's been rounded condemnation of Brett Herron, who is the Good Party member who came out in attacking Cameron, essentially. And there's been a rounded condemnation of the Daily Maverick's line of inquiry here through two of its journalists, one of them being Ferial Haffajee. But people are sort of like, no, actually, we have to have the right to defend ourselves. This is not in question. However progressive you are, there's a line. I don't know, Frans. I mean, what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, Gabriel, we've never tested self-defense explicitly in Poland.
No, we haven't.
But let's do that. But we've tested enough of other things that I'm very confident that Cameron and his actions would have the support of the overwhelming majority of South Africans, who exactly as Richard, what he does well, Richard, is he sort of describes the sort of forgotten people who suffer from all this terrible violence and crime. And yeah, the same thing here in that response to what Cameron did. When Richard was talking, I've been coming and going. I've been visiting Richard in Washington for 20 years. He never told me how dangerous it was. And I didn't really know until
because you hang around me, I'm very intimidating and scary. People shy away.
I don't know if I should come back again. Well, you do intimidate. I have seen people cross the road as you approach.
Yeah.
The point is, I pulled it up, just some of the numbers while you were talking. And if DC was a state, it would be at least twice as dangerous as any other state in America. That's how off the charts its violence numbers are. Coming second would be Louisiana, with a figure of now an American parlance homicide rate of 14.5. The current DC number I looked up is 27. And then there are a few others that sit near 10, but really a handful. And then the rest of America, if you go through, Maine 4.3, Connecticut 3.7, Montana 2.8, and New Hampshire's 1.8. So it seems terribly safe. Yeah. Do the people who protest this, who live in Washington, do you think they know how off the charts their homicide number was?
No, I think they stick to the yoga and the Pilates studio and the Starbucks and the Whole Foods and their office, and they never venture down to Anacostia or Southeast DC, where it actually is dangerous and where they have to deal with this kind of thing. There is a strange thing, though, and a lot of the problems we have is caused by far left progressive council members, including my own council member, a ghastly woman, who have been pushing this and this idea of restorative justice, and so basically stopping punishing people for crimes and trying to understand that the legacies of this and legacies of that and the impact of gentrification on crime. But there's a very curious thing, and you see this in two aspects. It's weird for me. Help me understand this. In DC, different states have different gun control. The Second Amendment it secures our rights to own firearms. But states can set their own laws. And DC as a district can set its laws on how difficult it is to own to get a firearm license. And it's very, very difficult. A friend of mine had it. They've had to loosen it up thanks to some lawsuits against them, but it's very difficult to get one as a lawful gun owner. But again and again and again, the DC Council passed laws that excuse criminals using guns. So they make it almost impossible for you to lawfully own a gun. But when a criminal uses a gun, unless it ends in the death of somebody, they almost always dismiss these cases and nothing happens, especially if they're teenagers running around with guns. Almost nothing happens to them. It's very strange that they have this two views. One, that illegal guns is bad. Legal gun owners are to be shamed and driven out. But if you're a criminal with a gun, well, there's all sorts of other factors and we need to be more understanding. And it's kind of like the same thing. They're not real parallels, but I don't understand this, and I'm just throwing this out here. Why is it that we make it almost impossible for anybody to smoke tobacco anywhere, but smoking pot, smoking marijuana is almost encouraged? Like everywhere you go, there are marijuana shops all over the place, and you walk around the streets and everyone's smoking marijuana and the smells everywhere. But try smoking tobacco, they're almost trying to shut down the sale of tobacco here. It's very strange. I don't understand why these two things exist. Anyway, throwing that out as a random thought.
I found some polls while you were talking of late August from Quinnipiac. I've never known how to say that.
Yeah.
Quinnipiac, so that's good. On whether it's good and correct for the National Guard to be deployed to DC. Republicans support the deployment 86-12. Democrats oppose at 93-5.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
Yeah. Well, these people partly they hate Trump, but I come back to this. These are the luxury beliefs. They're not feeling the effect of crime, and they don't mind actually. When somebody else has to suffer, and they don't mind abuses of power when it's their guy doing it, but they are incandescent with rage when it comes the other way. It makes me want to gag.
I think that kind of covers the topic very well, and it's a great lead into the next topic we're going to cover, which is another of these kind of luxury beliefs that people have been allowed to hold in the West that have wrought untold damage across a number of institutions. And James, I'm coming to you here because you're going to tell us about the end of history delusion. So James, can you start us just by telling us what the end of history theory was and kind of how it was accepted and promulgated and what effects it's had on the Western world and Western minds?
Sure. Well, it's it's an idea that sort of emerges really following the collapse of communism in the late 80s, the collapse of Soviet communism. As you know, the Eastern Bloc sheds the as the Soviet Union itself clearly no longer believes in the communist cause, and then Eastern Europe gains their freedom, the Soviet Union collapses. This idea emerges of the end of history, that this represents the triumph of liberal democracy and the ideas in the realm of ideas, at least. And it's expressed in a famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, first in The National Interest, and then he turns it into a book. And it's quite a nuanced sort of theoretical argument. But the essential point is, look, Western liberalism has triumphed, and now it's all about, you know, it's just a matter of time before everyone sort of else it's just a matter of time until there's a sort of universalization of liberal democracy as the sort of final form of human government. And it made sense at the time. I mean, even communist China was the Communist Party in China were hanging on by their fingernails. The West was, totally dominant, especially Britain, the United States, and America. And it's sort of only a matter of time then before these ideas at the level of ideas of consciousness then get translated into the material world. And so by now we should be, China should be a nice liberal democracy, and the West should be as sort of successful and prosperous as it's always been. And in fact, the sort of opposite has happened. I mean, China's, when it comes to the material world, is almost dominant now, but not yet spiritually or ideologically. And the West, as you know, we all see is in a mess, and is in a state of relative decline against both China and other Western powers. So there's a sort of shift against the Western world, and in terms of political liberalism or liberal democracy, that's stalled across the world. I think you can be. I don't quite know where the point was, but it's no longer this inevitable shift towards political liberal democracy. On the economic front, I think that's moved quite far and fast. But not on the political realm. So then the question then becomes: is the West in the state because Western liberal ideas have failed and actually have not proved so great at all, or is it because that sort of spiritually and ideologically the Western liberalism, at least in the West, has sort of become hollowed out? And I would argue that it's very much the latter, and you saw it in a way with the reaction to Trump's executive orders on South Africa, where he criticized the new Expropriation Act in South Africa, which drastically erodes property rights and allows the government and state organs to start taking people's property for below market value, ostensibly on racial grounds. And what was noticeable about that outraged reaction to that executive order was the entire Western liberal sort of progressive elites criticized Trump for daring to criticize the Expropriation Act, which is a serious threat in the long term, medium to long term, to property rights in South Africa. Now, if you don't believe in the sanctity of property rights and believe it's an evil to target people's property on the basis of their race, then you're not in any way a Western liberal at all. You just don't believe in the sort of core Western ideology. You've replaced it with some other god, whether that's racial equity or social justice or whatever. So then the question is sort of what happened, what went wrong? And here I'd argue that essentially, if you look at what was Western liberalism in the 1980s, or how did it differ from communism? I mean, they shared the same Enlightenment background. They were shared many of the same ideals: democracy, equality, material progress, even freedom of speech, according to their own understanding of it. But, if you read thinkers like Isaiah Berlin or whatever, liberalism was the ideology of hard choices. That you have many sort of ultimate sort of ends in society, or many values, and there are trade-offs between them. And you have an open debate and freedom of speech and reasoned debate, and you work out what are we going to choose. We can have equality or we can have liberty. What is the trade-off between them? And that's at the core. There's a belief that you cannot have all. You can't have your cake and eat it. Is the sort of essential core of what sort of liberalism was understood to be. And I think with the end of history, the idea of the end of history was a very destructive one for Western liberalism, because it sort of created this idea that, okay, we've won, we don't need to train anymore, we don't need to work out, we can just sit on the couch drinking beer the whole time, and we'll still be the fastest runner in the in the sort of in the club or whatever. And so the sort of Westerners no longer really tried to understand the enemy anymore, and the anti-liberal, anti-Western forces. There was no longer any effort to teach, the youth, students or whatever, the sort of values of liberal democracy, the ideas of liberal democracy, where it came from. Sort of imagine the communists in China not teaching, giving ideological training to the next generation and the generation and after that. But that's essentially what happened at Western universities. You just got sort of force-fed a diet of various forms of Marxist ideology, because, you'd won. So why even bother teaching your children what, Western liberalism entails? Because, there's no need to. It's going to triumph inevitably. But I think there was another thing, and I think it came in two phases, and that's the one that Western liberalism itself became quite utopian. That, in the 1980s, it was understood that, even within liberalism, you had to have trade-offs between these various different things and these various different sort of objectives, and you couldn't have everything all at once. But I think what started happening is the idea was you could pursue all these goals to the nth degree, and somehow this would usher in the millennium. Everyone had to have the most free labor market, the lowest tariffs, the sort of and I think that came a cropper in with the invasion of Iraq, where you tried to sort of impose liberal democracy by force on Iraqi society, and it's whatever the blunders were, it turned into a massive disaster and a forever war. And I think the suspicion of many sort of Americans today is that the war was kept going in order to sort of, enrich your sort of military-industrial complex. So that was the first phase of utopianism, which I suppose would be called neoliberalism by some people as well. But what you've moved into now is the same idea of you no longer, the sort of Western societies are going from one blunder to another, because there's no longer this understanding of the trade-offs that have to occur in sort of policy making or whatever. So you see this with the sort of energy policy. It's not like, yes, reducing sort of greenhouse gas emissions is good, but there are other considerations that have to apply, like, our economic growth or can, the prosperity of people, or
cost of electricity.
The cost of electricity, do you want an electricity bill that's twice as high as it was previously or not, So increasingly you sort of see utopian thinking within the Western elites, where, or with the with the COVID lockdowns, okay, obviously minimizing the spread of this virus is a good thing, but what are the trade-offs in locking down the entire society? So sort of chasing after one utopian objective after another, disregarding all the trade-offs and that sort of thing. So I think that's where we are now, is this inability, and another example is obviously sort of this illegal or unfettered immigration that's driving Western electorates mad because their governments are refusing to do anything about it. Again, it's ignoring the trade-offs that have to be made. And one of the trade-offs is, it's been well understood in European politics for decades, is that when European elites go soft on immigration, the voters shift to the right to try and send a message to the elites. And when the elites listen, then they shift back to the center again. But what you see this time is almost that these Western elites don't care. That even if this leads to the rise of, right-wing parties, which the elites themselves, describe in the sort of apoplectic terms as fascist or whatever, these elites will refuse to moderate on the immigration policies, even if the very predictable consequence is going to be an increase of the vote share of what is called the far right. Yeah, so that's where I think we are. Another just a last point on that is that Weber wrote a very famous essay called the politics as a vocation. And he said that in politics, there essentially there's a tension between what is called what he called the politics of ultimate ends and the politics of responsibility. And the politics of ultimate ends is that sort of, you must do what is right, and let and as long as that's fine, then let whatever the consequences are flow from that. And the ethics of responsibility are, you must have a sense of what the consequences are going to be of your actions, and also your failure to act. And again, I think you see this in what is described, what you see in a lot of progressive politics in the West, is that the sort of politics of ultimate ends is sort of overriding. And the politics of responsibility is not being, there's not enough attention paid to it. So like with crime, it's unpleasant to lock people up and to be tough on crime. But you have to do it, otherwise people live in fear in their societies. But for some reason, there's a sort of fear of acting on certain, well, I mean, you'd say there's a fear of acting, but they were willing to lock down entire societies with the COVID vaccine, with the COVID virus. But there's a sort of great reluctance to act against crime or act against, illegal immigration or whatever. So I suppose that's how it all ties together.
I think that there's a great quote from Edmund Burke that kind of sums up a bit of what we were saying. But what is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils, for it is folly, vice, and madness without tuition or restraint. France, I think you want to jump in here?
Yeah, it's hard to follow that from James and your quote, Gabriel, too, of course. The one thing I'd sort of prepared to say was that the end of history delusion has played out in a particular way in Western foreign policy, where there's been a great reluctance to bring hard power forward fast. And of course, this hasn't happened for China or Russia or Iran or anywhere else. And for a very long time, and until Trump comes along. And through tariffs, there is a willingness to bring hard power forward fast in order to pursue objectives. And I was just going to say, I think that if Trump has his head on strategy and foreign policy, and perhaps after his term ends, his sort of crew takes over and does another 4 years or so, or maybe 8. And this remains a feature of American foreign policy. The implications will be important.
Anyone else want to jump in?
No, it was a great piece by James. That was really, really interesting. Yeah. No, I was just saying it was fascinating.
I just want to ask James one question. So, there's this sort of meme of, hard times make for strong men make for good society. I'm going to mess this up, but make for good times make for weak men. Are we on that thing? Are we now in the hard times that we because we had weak men? Are you saying that we're not going to be going back to the weak times make for hard, the bad times make for hard men? I'm screwing this whole thing up, but you get the screen out. What I'm getting at, are we not going to go back on that cycle, do you think?
I suppose it depends on how hard the times sort of become, and I suppose Western democracy is in a way, undoubtedly the sort of a well-functioning Western liberal democracy is I think the best sort of society to live in, and compared to any other in human history. But I suppose it does have that effect that it's very comfortable, and you don't know how tough the world is sort of outside of it. I just want to say, there was a point I wanted to make which that got lost in there. If you look at how the Chinese responded to the collapse of the sort of end of history thesis, is they became quite a lot more liberal, not in the sense of their societies, but in terms of their thinking. And they started thinking in terms of trade-offs. So no longer in the Maoist sort of utopia, but in Deng Xiaoping's sort of, okay, what are our choices here? And so, okay, well, one of the considerations is we want to maintain, if we are going to maintain Communist Party rule, we need to liberalize economically and make our people, as successful and prosperous as quickly as possible in order to give legitimacy to the Communist Party. And, in terms of the communist, his view is that the Communist Party had to retain its monopoly on power in order to because no one else could govern China, and if the communists didn't govern, the alternative would have been chaos and warlordism of the kind that China sort of experienced in the early part of the 20th century. So that I think, and of course, interestingly, one of the first things he did in the late 70s when he came into power was restore the merit system in university admissions, which Mao had abolished, I think, and which the progressive elites today in the West are trying to get rid of as well. So in a way, you had the anti-Western world becoming thinking much more in terms of hard trade-offs, and the Western world starting to think that these trade-offs no longer existed, which I think is central to understanding the sort of weakness of the West today.
Well,
Yeah,
we
and I
have
think-
no trade-offs, no ability to make trade-offs here in the West. I mean, the United States says, what are we at? We're approaching $40 trillion in debt, most of it driven by entitlement spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and nobody will talk about cutting them. Nobody wants to make those trade-offs. And it comes to a point where we're spending more on interest on our debt than we are on our military. This becomes a foreign policy problem unless we deal with it. And Western Europe is in the same boat pretty much.
Yeah, and I think
You said, James, that... Sorry, Gabriel, do go.
no, Franz, go ahead.
You said that the sort of rule in Europe had been that when the politicians lose focus, the right rises, and that wakes them up, and they do what they should do. But this time, the argument is concessions might not be, the hard choices might not be made. Now, in Germany, AfD is ahead of the CDU in the German political data, I think for the first time. In the UK, Reform are well ahead of Labour and
29
the
points.
Conservatives. Yeah. In France, National Rally is well ahead of any of its rivals. I know it's a hard question to answer. Maybe we pick it up again. But what happens then in Europe now if let's say the tradition, however far right these people actually are, if the traditional centre isn't willing to make concessions, to make hard choices, does that flow into right-wing European politics just continue?
Also look at Denmark, where I think it's a fairly left-wing government. They clamp down on immigration, and there's no right-wing insurgency or far-right insurgency. So the puzzle is why these elites feel unable to act, even though they know that it's going to be, in their minds, the nightmarish consequence of it is going to be the rise of the far right. And they refuse to act, even though the sort of electorate is screaming out at them to act. And if they did act, the far right would then, its support would, I presume, sort of, decline again. And I that's still a mystery to me, is what it is in the Western elite consciousness that you feel unable to act, even if you know the consequences are going to be terrible, and maybe it's got something to do with what Weber said is a sort of ethic of ultimate ends, that it's about moral purity, about being virtuous, and that's all that matters. And if that leads to terrible consequences, that is not on your conscience. That's on the conscience of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to move to a country and a society that has not thought about trade-offs since 1997. Simon, I'm of course talking about the UK here, and you're going to tell us about the kind of looming economic crunch, crisis, whatever you want to call it, that's coming to the market, and what precipitated it. Where is the UK at, and where is it going?
Yeah, look, I think just to say that I think it's already here. And I think it's important to certainly of making sense and indeed common sense, that we examine stories and events through the dimension of aspiration, because that's instinctive and it builds rapport with people, ordinary people like us, who want the same things and look for them in the same places. But as it relates to a study of the UK economy and the prospects ahead, it's very, very difficult to see anything of potential. And I'm afraid unless really drastic action happens, and I'm not talking about policy changes, unless really drastic action happens, and I'll come to that later, the ultimate destination of where we are now is the front door of the International Monetary Fund in Washington. And the only consolation is that we'll probably be accompanied by the French, who will also be at the same time seeking a bailout. And this isn't new. And just some context, and let's go into some technical analysis as it relates to government bonds. Government bonds are low-risk securities that earn investors interest as they mature. And what happened in February 2024 was when I started realizing that the walls were caving in. Was when the yields on the short-term bonds went higher than the yields on the longer-term bonds. And bonds are different types and durations. But what that signaled was a recession. Now you've got a country that's bursting at the rafters with student campus economists, and they go, no, everything's going to be okay. It's not necessarily a recession. But the worry was there. And then in July, we had a change in government from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. And this is where this has no...
Simon, sorry, let me just take you back a second here. Can you just provide us a little bit with context? So give us a bit more of an explanation about what a bond is, and then linger on that point. I wanted to linger on that point about the short-term bonds having higher returns than the long-term bonds, because you just tell us exactly what a bond is, and then why that's a bad thing.
Okay, so you've got short-term bonds and longer-term bonds with the government. Okay, government bonds, gilts are what they're called in the UK, and the longer-term bonds have higher yields because people want more money for lending the government. Okay, and the shorter-term yields have smaller. The shorter-term bonds have smaller yields because it's a shorter-term thing. So when the short-term gilts overtake the longer-term bonds, that's when you know you have got a crisis of confidence in the management of the economy. Okay.
So the importance of that is that when you've got short-term bonds with higher yields than long-term bonds, what it essentially says is that it's like you are more risky to leave you're less likely to get paid in 2 years' time than in 10 years'
Correct.
time. Is that the kind of logic?
That's that is the vote of essentially no confidence in the management of the long-term economy. And that's what spiked in February last year, and it was the 7th time in 44 years that it had happened. Now, moving to July, that curve steepened because the markets factored the risk in, okay? But that still wasn't a vote of confidence in the incoming Chancellor's abilities. It was simply maneuvering around to accommodate concerns, and the suspicions and the skepticism remained throughout that period, all right? And we've had this festering now. We've had this festering for a very long time, but there is, just like James was saying earlier, there's no real willingness apparent to resolve this, and there hasn't been for a long time. And that's why this isn't like a political party issue. This isn't Labour or Conservative, who've been the two dominant parties in British politics for the longest time. This is something else. Now, let's go to the present, okay? Yesterday, it's the end of the summer recess for the politicians, and they're back at Parliament on the 1st of September. So let's take a snapshot of these gilts and where their financial position is generally. Yesterday, the 30-year gilt was around 5.6 heading upwards. Today, it crossed the 5.7%, which is very, very worrying. You've got public spending, which is out of control. The state is now £150 billion larger than it was in 2019. And admittedly, you had a spike in COVID and so on. You've got a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. When Tony Blair came into office in 1997, he had high borrowing costs, but the debt to GDP was only 36 to 37%, and he brought in people who were capable of addressing the problems. The interest on our debt, so we're paying £111 billion a year to service the interest on our debt. That's 2 times the education budget, and roughly, I think, £1 in every 12. But the most important thing here, and I think this is where, is there's just no economic growth. There's nothing. Okay, you have these occasional victory laps from these Labour politicians who say that 0.1% growth is indication that the next time there are announcements, it's going to be 7% growth. And it's financial illiteracy, economic illiteracy. So if you've got these problems, and this is the spending, this is the gilts, this is the interest on the debt, and no economic growth prospects, what do? So historically, there are four things that you can do. You can tax, you can curb public spending, you can print more cash with quantitative easing, or you can borrow. Now let's go to those four areas, okay? For tax, can't do it. It's already done, okay? The tax arrangement in the United Kingdom is like a South African taking a South African credit card to a bar in the south of France and getting handsy with magnums of rosé, and after two transactions, the bank just goes, no, no, not happening anymore. So tax is out the window. Then you can curb public spending. Well, that's been tried. 3 months ago, Keir Starmer tried to impose curbs on public spending. And what happened? There was a revolt amongst the backbenchers. And these are very serious people, but they are, it's like that wonderful American humorist from the 1800s, Artemus Ward, and he came up with a series of good one-liners. But the best, which captures these guys, is that he said, you must live within your means, even if it means borrowing to do so. That's the Labour backbencher economic orthodoxy. It's very, very worrying. Okay, so quantitative easing, printing more cash, is that an option? Of course it's not. You've got inflation lurking, and the next time that happens, under the conditions that we're in, you'll probably crash the sterling. And then finally, there's borrowing. Can you borrow more money? Well, look at the markets. And by the market, I mean the sovereign wealth funds, their investment banks, their insurers. These guys are looking at the UK government. They don't care what the Bank of England says. They are saying something is very wrong. This stinks. And we are moving to a position where UK debt is untouchable. So that's the situation as it stands, with all of these forces and factors that have motivated it. Technically, there are 4 steps that need to happen before the IMF are approached. The first is that the gilt auctions start falling. The second is that you start seeing your mortgage rates start soaring, and the Bank of England starts panicking, and then the currency starts exploring new lows. And what's happened today, in reverse order, the pound the sterling has dropped, and it's dropped because it's another expression of no confidence in Keir Starmer. He's arrived back from his holidays, I don't know, to the clothing optional resort in Northern Holland, wherever these liberal guys like to go vacation, and he's come back and he said, no, I've assembled like this crack squad of highly decorated economists, and we're going to figure this one out. And we go, okay, so who have you put together? And he goes, this woman is Manish Shafiq. And so Manish Shafiq. So she is a life peer. She's a permanent occupant of the House of Lords. That's not very helpful. She was previously a deputy at the Bank of England. That too isn't very helpful. And thirdly, she was formerly the president of Columbia University until she resigned because she couldn't control student uprisings at that university. So she can't discipline wayward students, but she's going to come and she's going to figure out this financial catastrophe. So the point is that we're at all of these movements, all of these forces, they are pointing at the IMF. So what options does Keir Starmer have? And as far as I can see, and the people I've spoken to, is that an early election is probably the only way out. But that's caveated. But, you know, he's got the choice. Do you consciously call for an early election as a referendum of people's confidence in your management of the economy? Or do you let the markets humiliate you into one? And I'm not sure which one he's going to take. And even if we do go to the IMF, is the IMF big enough to be able to accommodate what the United Kingdom needs? That's not a question that's been answered, and that's not a question the answer can't be seen. It may be a collection of nations. It may be an institutional nation collaboration. Who knows? But that's where this country is. And I was with a conservative politician earlier today, who's quite a young, and what he says is really interesting, because there's a profile emerging amongst people who recognize the scale of the problem. And again, it doesn't have a party, but it's a generational thing. And he's told me that the political class of boomers have really painted a target on their back. Because many of the political class of boomers of today, their parents were World War II veterans. And their fathers would have come back from deployment in Europe and said, son, I've just been in Belgium. And those people don't have proper drains. They have to pee in a bucket, and then they have to take the bucket and throw it out into the road. Don't let that ever happen to the United Kingdom. And the boomer went, whatever. They failed to invest in infrastructure, and they'll be known as the generation that made the succeeding ones poorer. It's a really, really precarious situation, and I can't see a way out other than those elections that I mentioned, but even then, who knows what the response will be. Back to you, Gabriel.
Yeah, I think on that point, a last thing that might be interesting is the kind of perspectives that you get from the people whose money you manage. Trying to sell them on this idea that we need to do something. Like, how do we protect your money? What are you doing? Are you just essentially going, let's find the ways to get all of your money out of the country so that we're covering you that way? Or we're like, what is the response to all of these signs?
So I'll tell you that. So firstly, it's always a good idea, and it has been for the last 4 years, to look at uncorrelated asset classes, which are somewhat insulated from market rhythms. And there are a bunch of people that have done a lot of really good work in looking at havens, essentially investment havens, and asset classes that do not feel the bumps in the way that others and more traditional ones do. But I've got an associate who founded a multifamily office in Geneva, in Switzerland, which is supposedly a reasonably, and I'm sure you would all agree, stable place. He has been going for gold, basically, literally going. He's been long on gold for the past 5 years, because he's seen the ups and downs in the investment market, specifically through tech, and he made the decision before this. And I think that I see through his views, and people will call that radical and whatever they will, but as it relates to a response to what could happen in Britain, and indeed what could happen in France, I have to say that he's got the idea. It's a smart move. Certainly if it's other people's money that you're looking after and who trust you with.
Yeah, I think that point in the markets and the response to it actually brings us quite nicely into our final topic of discussion, and we're going to stay on
ask
the...
a quick question? Do
Of
we have
course,
time
go
for a
ahead,
quick
Rick.
question? So, Simon, I mean, we had Liz Truss, who is widely kind of ridiculed by the great and the good and the commentators, and I think the shortest UK Prime Minister, but her agenda seemed to be one of growth, and she may have got the sequence wrong, she may have got the communication wrong. My question to you is, but now she's kind of ridiculed. Is that still true? I mean, are people rethinking what she tried to do? I mean, how are people perceiving Liz Truss given the deepening mess that Britain is in now?
Well, the serious commentators, and there are a few, and you can look them up. There's Liam Halligan, who's a really smart economist and broadcaster, was a former fund manager. There's James Bartholomew, and so on. And these guys always knew, and it's what I alluded to last week, in that Liz Truss had absolutely the right agenda, and she was 100% correct to approach it as she did, but she did ride roughshod over the institutions, and she shouldn't have done that, because she underestimated the power that they had to basically turn the machine back on her. But as it relates to a pro-growth angle, she was completely right, and she's been vindicated because the 30-year borrowing cost under Rachel Reeves at present is much higher than it was under Liz Truss when she introduced that mini budget in 2022. So yes, to answer your question, she is being vindicated, whether the mainstream economists accept it or not.
Okay. So I think let's then turn now, France, to you and stay on this theme of economic data and economics, but move away from the UK market and to its former colony, our home, South Africa. So can you tell us, France, about debt and the deficit in South Africa?
Yeah, well, as it turns out, the show kind of wraps up pretty nicely because, if we started with hard choices and sort of play one thing off against the consequences, and then Simon's sort of briefing to us, we come back to a former British colony. And in 1994, South Africa has been through about 50 years of apartheid rule. It's had an election. And the African National Congress, which was the political party of Nelson Mandela, has been exiled in Eastern Europe for a very long period of time, takes command. And what the ANC inherits is not great. The South African economy had grown quite quickly in the 1950s and into the 1960s. But by the 70s, it's starting to collapse under the weight of its contradictions because it's trying to exclude a significant share of the population from full participation in the benefits of that economic expansion. And economic growth in the 70s and 80s averages very low rates in a very volatile manner. And debt levels have climbed, etc. And the ANC takes control in 1994 of the national finances. And it inherits a debt level of 44% of national government debt, 44% of GDP, and a budget deficit of about 5%. And it sets off. What does it do? And in what really should be lectured, it would seem, in London these days, 13 years after coming to power, it has cut debt to GDP exactly in half. The number is 27%. And the budget deficit that it's inherited has also 13 years later translated into the first multi-year surpluses that the South African economy had recorded, not since democracy, but since the formation of the union, because we've got the data on that going back more than 100 years. The formation of the union in 1910. At the same time, just to make this an even more incredible story, when the ANC came to power, there were about 2 or 3 million people receiving welfare payments every month out of a population of about 40 or 50 million. And as it hit those surplus numbers for the first time, it had expanded the welfare net to more than 10 million people, a 5-fold increase. In fact, more than that, it was a six-fold increase in approximately in the number of people receiving welfare grants. And there's a story behind that I think parts of it are probably true, that Mandela, out of prison, finds his ANC colleagues and says to them, listen, the mess we're inheriting from the whites is so serious that if we do not grow the economy, we will be at the door of the IMF, where Simon says the UK and France might end up. And we'll be begging for a bailout. And the consequence of that is that our revolution will fail, because that's how they'll get us in the West. And the budget speech will be dictated from Washington. And it's an era, and I mean, there's good fortune and all of that, a little bit of that in it too, but it's an era for which the ANC in government never got the credit or recognition anywhere in the world for what was probably the most spectacular performance of reining in debt and a debt position and a deficit, whilst at the same time making possible if you support such things, a very expansive social welfare net. And it's just as you look at the UK now, or what the position in France is, it's just a story to bear in mind, I think. Gabriel.
I think there's something that's sparked into my head as you were talking about this, because one of the lines of the Common Sense and one of the things that you've spoken about very often, Franz, is the kind of two eras of the ANC. You've now told us, taken us through this incredible fiscal management of the early ANC's administrations. But would you say, maybe, and kind of in line with the themes, one of the themes of our conversation today, that the turning point for the ANC was the point at which they decided that they no longer had to make these hard decisions? Because I think Mbeki understood this idea of trade-offs, that you couldn't just have your cake and eat it too. And he was very effective in his economic management at making the trade-offs work. And then we've now had an era in which the assumption has always been there is no trade-off. We can do whatever we like.
Yeah, as James was talking, in fact, that was exactly the thought that was becoming clearer. Was that, even I actually thought to myself, to what extent is the problem in the ANC that it got very infected with the same Western ailment and hasn't been able to make the hard choices. And, Mr. Mbeki likes to think about these things. Hopefully he'll listen to this. And if he does, we'd certainly like to have him around and a chat just maybe on the subject about the very hard choices. But not. And you see, the thing about his era was that it wasn't. The hard choices didn't culminate in terrible, fateful sort of losses politically or in terms of living standards or anything of that nature. There were gains all round. Politically, he grew the party. He took over from Mandela. And when Mandela had done the first election in 94, he had 63% of the vote. When Mr. Mbeki led it into the election 10 years later, he took that number to almost 70%. Now, there were other things going on too, but there's a score. I say sometimes there's a scoreboard for politicians. And in the end, you've got to look at the scoreboard. And Thabo Mbeki had the ANC at almost 70%, budget surplus, 5-fold increase in welfare payments, doubled the number of people in employment, and there were other issues too, obviously. But you can sometimes, I think, just pause on something like that and say, on the scoreboard, yeah.
So it turns out growth is everything, right? It doesn't just lift all boats; it lifts political boats too.
Yeah.
Yes,
we seem to forget
and sinks them. As the ANC 15 years later is coming to learn and now completely unable to make the hard decisions to save itself. And I mean, just so I participate in this podcast, but just to listen to this from it's very, very good. This one, Gabriel, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Franz. And, we've spoken at length today about hard choices, but we have given our audience the easiest choice, which was to watch this podcast all the way to the end. So thank you to all of you who have made it to the end of this week's episode. And thank you to our esteemed panel for this fascinating conversation. And tune back in next week, ladies and gentlemen, for another episode of Makin Sense. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this is Makin Sense.